You are nothing on this base. Nothing. Senior Chief Voss grabbed Brooke by the collar and threw her back against the wall of the trauma bay so hard the metal dented. "You do not touch my men," he roared, his forearm crushing across her chest, his face 2 inches from hers. "You are a nurse, a civilian. You are nothing on this base." 3 of his operators stood frozen in the doorway, watching their leader physically pin a woman half his size against the wall. A woman who had, 60 seconds ago, just saved one of theirs with her bare hands while Voss was still pulling on his boots. She looked at him without blinking, without flinching, without a single word. That stillness, that absolute unshakable stillness, was the first sign that Voss had made the worst mistake of his career. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night Brooke Aldridge arrived at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, the temperature outside was 94 degrees, and the generator had been running on a prayer and duct tape for 11 days straight. Nobody came out to greet her. Nobody had been told to. The manifest listed her simply as Contract Medical, Aldridge, B, and that was all anyone needed to know. She was a nurse, she was a replacement, and she was supposed to stay out of the way. She stepped off the back of a dust-caked MRAP with a single duffel bag, a medical kit secured to her right shoulder, and the kind of posture that does not come from yoga or good genetics. It comes from years of carrying weight that does not belong to your body. Rifles, ammunition, fallen friends. Anyone who had served would have recognized it immediately. But the 2 junior operators who watched her walk across the dirt didn't think about any of that. One of them, a kid named Petty Officer Halstead, leaned over to his buddy and said, "Think she knows where the chow hall is?" His buddy shrugged. "Think she cares?" Brooke didn't. She had already clocked the entry points, the guard rotation, the distance between the motor pool and the trauma bay, and the single weak spot in the eastern berm where the wire had been patched with what looked like a zip tie and wishful thinking. She noted it the way you note a crack in your car's windshield, quietly, without drama, filing it away for later. The trauma bay was a converted storage container that someone had painted white once, a long time ago. Now it was the color of a memory. Inside there were 2 metal gurneys, a supply cabinet with a padlock that had been broken and reattached so many times the hasp barely held, a wall-mounted defibrillator that blinked amber instead of green, and a single folding chair in the corner with a cushion somebody had duct-taped to the seat. Brooke stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in. "You must be the new FMF, said a voice behind her. She turned. A young man, maybe 23, stood holding a clipboard and wearing the look of someone who had been working double shifts for so long, his eyelids had forgotten how to fully open. His name tape said Dylan, and he had the careful, precise hands of a medic who had learned the hard way that carelessness costs lives. "I'm not Fleet Marine Force," Brooke said. "I'm contract, trauma nurse." "Same difference out here," Dylan said. He extended his hand. "HM2 Dylan Cross. I've been solo for 6 days. The last contractor got medevaced out with a kidney stone the size of a thumbnail. You have no idea how glad I am you're here." Brooke shook his hand. "Aldridge. First name?" "Aldridge." Dylan nodded slowly, reading something in her face that told him not to push. "Okay, Aldridge it is." He stepped past her into the bay and started walking her through the inventory, pointing at each shelf with the clipboard. "Morphine is locked. I have the key. Blood supply is low. We've been waiting on a resupply for 4 days. Suture kits are current. We've got 1 working chest tube kit, and I already told the LT that if we take any serious thoracic trauma before resupply, we are going to be improvising." He wrote it down. That means nothing happened with it. "Who's the commanding officer?" "Lieutenant Commander Ferris. Good man, busy man. You'll see him when something goes wrong." Dylan paused. which statistically is approximately every 72 hours on this FOB. And the platoon leader, the SEALs, something shifted in Dylan's expression. It was small, but Brooke caught it. Senior Chief Voss, he said. He runs the operators. He also runs the debrief, the manifest, the patrol schedule, and, in his mind, everything else on this base, including the trauma bay. He glanced at her sideways. He's going to tell you to stay in your lane. I'm sure he will, Brooke said. She started unpacking her duffel. Dylan watched her for a moment. The way she arranged her personal kit, tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, a secondary blade, a folded field dressing she had customized herself, was not the way a hospital nurse packed. He had seen enough of them rotate through to know the difference. But he didn't say anything. He just picked up his clipboard and went back to counting supplies. 3 days passed. Brooke fell into the rhythm of the base, the way water finds its level, quietly and without complaint. She ran the trauma bay with a precision that made Dylan feel, for the first time in weeks, like he could actually sleep without one ear open. She restructured the supply cabinet so that critical items were accessible in the dark. She recalibrated the defibrillator. She fixed the padlock. She even found a working blood pressure cuff in a box of equipment that had apparently been sitting unopened since the previous rotation. The operators noticed. They didn't comment because commenting wasn't something they did about things that simply made sense, but they noticed. Voss did not notice. Or rather, Voss noticed in the way that territorial people notice change, as a potential threat, not a contribution. The first time he came into the trauma bay, it was to check on one of his men, Petty Officer First Class Torres, who had caught a piece of shrapnel from a vehicle rollover and needed a wound check. Brooke had already completed the dressing. She was writing her notes when Voss walked in, looked at Torres, looked at the fresh bandage, and then looked at Brooke like she had just rearranged his house without asking. "He's fine," Brooke said without looking up. "I can see that," Voss said. "Then you don't need to be in here." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Torres looked at the ceiling with the studied neutrality of a man who had learned that when two immovable objects approach each other, the smart thing to do is become part of the furniture. Voss took a step closer to the desk where Brooke was writing. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from a block of granite, and a voice that was accustomed to ending conversations rather than continuing them. "Let's get something straight," he said. "I don't know who sent you, and I don't know what your file says. But on this base, in this team, we have a chain of command, and the trauma bay is part of this base." Brooke looked up. Her eyes were green-gray, and they had the kind of steadiness that comes not from being unafraid, but from having long ago decided that fear was a tool, not a master. "You're right," she said. "The trauma bay is part of this base, which is why I reorganized it so that, in the event of a mass casualty event, your men have a better chance of surviving long enough to be evacuated. You're welcome." She went back to her notes. Voss stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. Torres exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a week. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that man has made grown men cry." "I've seen worse," Brooke said. Torres believed her. He wasn't sure why, but he believed her completely. What nobody on FOB Kestrel knew, not Dylan, not Torres, not even the lieutenant commander who had signed her contract paperwork without reading past the credentials, was what Brooke Aldridge's file actually contained. They knew she had a nursing degree from the University of Arizona. They knew she had combat trauma experience in multiple theaters. They knew she was licensed, certified, and that her references had all checked out. What they didn't know was that those references included 2 retired colonels and a sitting congressman who owed her a debt he could never repay. What they didn't know was that she had been a United States Marine. Not a support Marine, not a logistics Marine, a combat Marine. One of the first women selected for the Lioness program, a classified initiative that embedded female Marines with infantry units so they could search and interact with local women in ways that male soldiers couldn't without causing cultural incidents. On paper, it was cultural liaison work. In reality, it put Brooke Aldridge in some of the most kinetic environments of the entire war, with a rifle in her hands and nothing but training and instinct standing between her and incoming fire. She had done 3 combat deployments before she ever held a nursing degree. She had earned a Purple Heart before most of the operators on this base had finished their first Bud/S qualification. She had held a man's throat together with her fingers for 40 minutes in the back of a Humvee until they reached a surgical unit, talking to him the whole time, keeping him in the world through the sheer force of her voice, because the alternative was unacceptable to her. His name had been Lance Corporal James Rooker. Everyone called him Rook. He didn't make it. The bracelet on Brooke's right wrist, plain silver, etched with 3 letters, JRR, had been on her wrist every day since the memorial service. She had showered with it. She had operated in it. She had once broken a man's wrist and not noticed until afterward that she'd left a faint mark from the bracelet on his skin. She never talked about it, but she never took it off. On the 4th day, Dylan caught her in the supply room at 0200 hours, reorganizing the surgical kit by the light of a headlamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she said, without turning around, "Either come in or go back to sleep." He came in. He sat on an overturned crate and watched her work. After a while, he said, "Where'd you do your trauma training?" "Bethesda," she said, "and before that, the field." "The field," he repeated. "Which field?" "The kind that doesn't have a map," she said. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway." "Yeah," he looked at the floor. "The way you move in here, the way you organize the bay, the way you talk to Voss, that's not... I've worked with a lot of contractors. You're not the same." Brooke was quiet for a moment. Her hands kept moving, steady and deliberate, placing items with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so deep it lives in the bones rather than the brain. "Go to sleep, Dylan," she said finally. He went, but he didn't stop thinking about it. The morning of day 5 brought a patrol rotation debrief and a logistics update, and Brooke was not invited to either. She didn't expect to be. She spent the morning treating a burn on Petty Officer Halstead's forearm. "Cooking accident," he said, with the particular evasiveness of someone who has been dumb near open flame and knows it, and restocking the IV bags that had come in on the overnight supply drop. It was during that restock that she heard the voices through the thin aluminum wall of the trauma bay. Voss and Lieutenant Commander Ferris. She didn't try to listen, but the walls were thin and Voss was not a quiet man when he thought he was in private. "I'm telling you, sir, she's a liability," Voss said. "She's civilian. She's got an attitude problem, and she's been making changes to my operational medical infrastructure without clearing it with me." "It's not your medical infrastructure, Senior Chief," Ferris said, with the weariness of a man who had this conversation many times in many forms. "On my base, sir, with my men." She reorganized the supply cabinet and fixed the defibrillator, Ferris said. "3 of your guys told me the bay is better than it's been in 2 rotations." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Senior Chief?" There was a pause. Brooke could picture Voss choosing his words the way some men choose their weapons. For maximum effect, minimum exposure. "She doesn't belong here," he said. "I don't know what her background is. I don't know who vouched for her, and I don't know why she walks around this base like she owns it. That bothers me." "It bothers you that the nurse is competent," Ferris said. "It bothers me that she's something more than a nurse, and nobody's telling me what." There was silence. Then Ferris said in a different tone, "Leave it alone, Voss." That was all. Footsteps, then quiet. Brooke stood very still for a moment, an IV bag in each hand. Then she set them down, wrote the inventory count in the log, and went back to work. That evening, Torres came back to the trauma bay, not for a wound check this time, but carrying 2 cups of coffee, which he set on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a peace offering. Brooke looked at them, then at him. "I'm not going to like you just because you brought coffee," she said. "I'm not trying to make you like me," Torres said. "I'm trying to apologize." Brooke picked up one of the cups. "For what?" "For Voss." Torres sat down in the chair across from her. He was in his 30s, compact and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had seen enough to be serious, but still hadn't forgotten how to laugh. "He's not a bad man, he just doesn't—" Torres stopped. "He's not great with people he can't categorize." "And he can't categorize me," Brooke said. "Nobody can." Torres looked at her steadily. "I've been doing this for 11 years. I know how people carry themselves. And you, Aldridge, you carry yourself like someone who's been shot at." Brooke drank her coffee. "A lot," Torres added. "This coffee is terrible," Brooke said. "Worst on the base," Torres agreed. "But it's hot, and it's here, which puts it ahead of most things in life." Brooke almost smiled. It was a small thing barely there, but Torres saw it and filed it away like something valuable. He left 20 minutes later. At the door, he turned back and said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." "Don't be glad yet," Brooke said. "The week isn't over." She didn't know how right she was. It was 3:47 in the morning on the 6th day when the VBIED detonated at the eastern gate. The explosion hit the base like a fist. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't distant. It was the kind of detonation that goes through your chest before your brain has time to process that you've heard it. It shook the walls of the trauma bay hard enough to knock 2 supply containers off the top shelf. It killed the generator. It plunged the entire base into total darkness for 3 full seconds before the backup power sputtered to life. Brooke was already awake, not because she had heard something coming, not because of any particular premonition. She was awake because she had learned, years ago, that sleep on a forward operating base was never really sleep. It was a kind of controlled rest in which some part of your mind stayed on watch, even while the rest of you tried to recover. She had her boots on before the echo of the blast had finished rolling across the desert. Dylan burst through the bay door 14 seconds after the explosion. He was still pulling his gloves on. "VBIED at the east gate," he said, already reaching for the trauma kit. "At least 2 vehicles. I heard secondary detonation." "How many down?" Brooke said. She was already at the cabinet pulling out triage packs with both hands. "Unknown. Patrol is bringing them in. I heard Voss on the radio. He said he's got a minimum of 4 casualties, possible 2 urgent surgical." "Get the gurneys to the door," Brooke said, "and get me light, real light, not the backup strip. Find the portable floods from the maintenance locker." "Maintenance locker's on the other side of the base." "Then run," she said. Dylan ran. Brooke worked in the near dark for 40 seconds alone, setting up the bay for mass casualty intake with a kind of focused efficiency that turns muscle memory into art. 5V lines primed, airway kit open, tourniquet rack accessible from both sides of the primary gurney. She had done this before. She had done this in worse conditions, with less equipment, with the floor shaking beneath her feet and the building above her on fire. The first casualties came in at 3:51. 2 operators, both walking wounded, lacerations, blast overpressure, 1 probable broken radius. Brooke assessed them in seconds, assigned them to the secondary gurney with instructions, and turned to the door just as Torres came through it, carrying a man over his shoulders. The man was Petty Officer 2nd Class Webb. He was unconscious. He had shrapnel in his right side, a burn across his left arm, and a pulse that Brooke clocked at thready the moment she pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "Gurney," she said. Torres laid him down. Brooke's hands were already moving. "He went down in the secondary blast," Torres said. "I don't know how long he was out." "Step back," Brooke said. Not harshly, clearly. Torres stepped back. Outside, the shooting started. It was not the scattered fire of a disorganized attack. It was coordinated, 2 directions, overlapping. The kind of pattern that means someone studied the base before they hit it. Brooke heard it with one part of her brain, while the other part stayed focused on Webb's vitals, on the shrapnel entry, on the sound of his breathing, which told her everything she needed to know about whether his lung was compromised. It was. "Dylan," she called. "Coming," his voice, from outside, getting closer. The door banged open. Dylan came through with the portable floodlights in a face that had gone pale under his tan. "There are shooters at the north fence," he said. "I just saw Baptiste and his team moving up. Brooke, they're inside the wire." The two words landed in the trauma bay like a second explosion. Inside the wire. Torres moved toward the door. Brooke said without looking up from Webb, "Torres, I need you here. There are shooters. And there is a man on this table whose lung is failing," Brooke said, her voice absolutely level. "If you leave right now, he dies in this bay while the operators outside live. You make the call." Torres stopped. He looked at Webb. He looked at the door. He looked at Brooke, whose hands had not stopped moving for a single second. He stayed. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Chest tube kit," Brooke said. "Top shelf, left side, red case. And I need you to hold his arm exactly like this." She moved Torres's hands into position. "And do not let go. Regardless of what you hear outside, do not let go." "Got it," Torres said. Outside, the gunfire intensified, and Brooke Aldridge, trauma nurse, contract civilian, mystery woman from Arizona, reached into the place inside herself where the Marine still lived, and she got to work. The chest tube went in clean. Brooke's hands did not shake. They never shook. That was the thing about her that Dylan had noticed first and understood last. Her hands operated on a completely separate frequency from the rest of the world. The gunfire outside could be getting closer. The walls could be vibrating. A man's blood could be spreading across the gurney in a dark, fast pool. And Brooke Aldridge's hands moved like she was threading a needle on a Sunday afternoon with nothing but time and quiet around her. Webb gasped. Then his chest expanded properly for the first time since they'd brought him in, and Torres made a sound that was half relief and half prayer. "Hold the line," Brooke said, not to Torres, not to Dylan, but to Webb himself, even though he was unconscious. She said it the way you say something to a person who is standing at the edge of a cliff and hasn't decided yet which way to fall. "Stay with me. You stay with me right now." Dylan was at the second gurney managing the two walking wounded, the operators with lacerations and blast concussion, when the door banged open again and Staff Sergeant Marcus Baptiste came through it backward, pulling a man by the drag handle on his vest. Baptiste was a Marine, attached to the FOB as part of the advisory element, and he was bleeding from a gash above his left eyebrow that had turned the entire left side of his face red. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes found Brooke immediately. "I've got Lieutenant Carver," Baptiste said. He took a round, upper left chest. "Put him on the floor," Brooke said. "Flat. Now." "The floor. Both gurneys are occupied and he needs to be flat. Floor. Now, Sergeant." Baptiste put Carver on the floor. Brooke was already moving, already dropping to her knees, already pressing fingers to the entry wound with one hand and reaching back for supplies with the other without looking. The motion was so fluid, so automatic, that Baptiste stood above her with blood running into his eye and watched her like he was watching something he had never seen before and knew he would never forget. "Seal it," she told Dylan across the room. Dylan threw her a chest seal without being told which one. She caught it without looking up. Outside, a burst of automatic fire raked the north wall. Something exploded. Not another VBIED, smaller, an RPG maybe, and the backup power flickered. The portable floodlights Dylan had brought held steady. Brooke did not look up. "Baptiste," she said. "Yeah? How many shooters on the north fence?" Baptiste blinked. Blood dripped from his chin. "You want a tactical assessment right now?" "I want to know what we're managing," Brooke said. Her hands pressed the seal over Carver's wound with exact controlled pressure. Number of shooters. Breach status. Where is Voss? Baptiste stared at her for one full second. Then something shifted in his expression. A recalibration. Fast, incomplete. The kind that happens when a soldier suddenly realizes the person they're talking to is not who they thought. 5 to 7 shooters confirmed north fence, he said, his voice dropping into the clipped cadence of a situation report. Possible secondary element probing the south. Breach is contained but not closed. They blew the gate hinges. Our guys are holding with 2 fire teams. Voss is at the command post coordinating close air. Is the command post compromised? Not yet. Then the breach stays open for now, Brooke said, which means they'll push again. She finished sealing Carver's wound, assessed his airway, his color, his pulse, all in under 8 seconds. He's stable. Keep pressure there. She stood. She looked at the room. Webb on the gurney breathing, Carver on the floor holding, 2 operators on the secondary gurney, Dylan moving between them like a man trying to be in 3 places at once. She looked at Baptiste. Sit down. I'm fine. You've lost enough blood to make that statement inaccurate, she said. Sit down and let me look at your head. Baptiste sat. It was automatic, the sitting. The kind of compliance that happens not because you've been ordered, but because the person speaking to you has absolute authority in their voice, and your body simply responds before your brain can object. Brooke examined the gash above his eye. It was deep, but not arterial. She pulled a staple kit from her pocket, not from the cabinet, from her pocket, because she had started carrying one there on day 2, and closed the wound in 4 quick placements while Baptiste hissed through his teeth. You always carry those in your pocket? He said. Head wounds bleed fast, she said. You don't always have time to go to the cabinet. Baptiste looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face. Then he said very quietly, Who are you? I'm the nurse, Brooke said. She pressed a square of gauze to his forehead and pressed his own hand over it. Hold that. The radio on Baptiste's vest crackled. Voss's voice came through, tight and controlled. Baptiste, report. Where are you? Baptiste keyed his radio. Trauma bay. Dropped off Carver. Getting patched. Get back to the north fence. We need your team on the left flank. Shooters are repositioning. Copy, Baptiste said. He stood. He looked at Brooke one more time. She had already moved back to Webb and was checking his tube placement, her back to him, focused entirely on the man in front of her. Baptiste left. The next 18 minutes were the most concentrated violence of the night. Brooke knew this not from looking out the door, but from the rate at which casualties arrived. 3 more in the first 6 minutes, 2 with shrapnel wounds and 1 with a gunshot to the thigh that had nicked the femoral and was trying very hard to kill the man before he made it through the door. She caught that one herself, her hands on the wound before the operator carrying him had fully set him down, pressure applied with a directness that made the wounded man's eyes snap open from the shock of it. Stay awake, she told him. What's your name? Petty Officer Reyes, he said through gritted teeth. Reyes, you look at me. You keep your eyes on me. It hurts like... I know exactly how much it hurts, she said. Look at me anyway. He looked at her. She held pressure on the femoral while Dylan ran a line into Reyes's arm at the same time, both of them working the same patient simultaneously without bumping each other, without a word spoken between them, with the kind of synchronized efficiency that takes years to develop. Dylan had been working with Brooke for 6 days. He had somehow already learned her rhythms. He noticed this about himself later, and it would unsettle him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Torres appeared at the door at the 18-minute mark. He had blood on his vest that was not his own, a split lip, and the look of a man who had just done something very hard and was not done yet. North fence is holding, he said, but Voss wants to know if we can move casualties to the secondary building. He's worried the trauma bay is too exposed. The trauma bay is not being moved, Brooke said, without stopping what she was doing. Carver can't be moved. Webb can't be moved. Reyes can't be moved. Anyone who can walk to a secondary building doesn't need a trauma bay. They need a bandage and a water bottle. Tell Voss that. Torres looked at her for a moment. He's not going to like that. Then he's going to have to not like it from the command post, Brooke said, because I am not moving my patients. Torres almost smiled despite everything. He keyed his radio and relayed the message, word for word, exactly as she had said it. There was a pause on the other end that had texture to it, the texture of a man controlling himself with significant effort. Then Voss said, "Copy," and nothing else. The shooting outside shifted. The pattern changed. Brooke heard it, the intervals, the movement of the sound, the way automatic fire has a geography if you've listened to enough of it. She had listened to enough of it. "They're pulling back," she said. Dylan looked up from Reyes. "How do you—" "The fire is moving away, not toward. They're repositioning or withdrawing. Baptiste's team pushed them off the flank." She checked Webb's tube again, checked Carver's seal, checked Reyes's pressure. "Which means we have maybe 4 to 8 minutes before they either disengage completely or hit us from a different direction. Either way, that window is when I need you to be ready to move fast." "Move fast for what?" Dylan said. "For whatever comes through that door next," Brooke said. What came through the door next was not a casualty. It was Voss. He came in at a fast walk, radio in hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been running the battlefield in his head and found something that didn't add up. He looked at the room, the organized, somehow still functioning trauma bay with 4 critical patients and 2 medical personnel who appeared to have everything under control, despite the fact that the base had just been hit with a coordinated assault. And for a moment, he said nothing. Then his eyes landed on Brooke. "Carver?" he said. "Stable," she said. "Webb?" "Stable. Chest tube is holding." "Reyes?" "Femoral pressure is controlled. He needs a surgical team within 6 hours, but he will make that window." Voss looked at Carver on the floor. He looked at Webb on the gurney. He looked at Reyes, who was conscious in watching the exchange with the particular attention of a man who knows that the conversation happening above him is about more than his injury. Then Voss looked at Brooke and said, "You put a chest tube in." "I did." "That's a surgical procedure." "It is." "You're a nurse," he said. The word came out the same way it always did when he used it, as a category, a limitation, a box with edges. Brooke pulled off her gloves. She looked at Voss with the full weight of a woman who had been tolerating this particular conversation for 6 days and had just spent the last 18 minutes saving 4 lives while bullets hit the north wall. "I am a nurse," she said. "I'm also the only reason 3 of your men are breathing right now. So whatever you came in here to establish about my qualifications can wait until my patients are stable and your base is secure. Are we clear?" The room was absolutely silent, except for the distant sound of sporadic gunfire winding down and the steady beep of the monitor Dylan had managed to get running on Webb's line. Voss stared at her. This was the moment, and everyone in the room felt it, where something had to give. Either Voss was going to assert his authority in a way that would fracture something irreparably, or he was going to do something much harder. He looked at Webb, he looked at Carver. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" Brooke blinked, just once. It was the only sign that the answer had surprised her. "Blood resupply. I'm through half my stock and the night isn't over, and I need someone to hold this pressure on Reyes for 10 minutes while Dylan and I check the others." Voss handed his radio to Torres, crossed the room, and pressed both hands down on Reyes's wound, exactly where Brooke pointed. Reyes looked up at his senior chief with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and complete disbelief. "Senior chief," he said carefully, "you're holding my—" "I'm aware of what I'm holding, Reyes," Voss said. Yeah, okay." Dylan caught Brooke's eye across the room. She gave him nothing, No smile, no acknowledgement, no "told you so." She just turned back to work. It was 4:31 in the morning. The attack had lasted 44 minutes. In those 44 minutes, Brooke Aldridge had managed 6 critical casualties, performed 2 chest tube insertions, controlled 1 near-fatal femoral bleed, supervised Dylan through 3 procedures he had never done unsupported, and done it all without raising her voice above the register of complete, unhurried authority. The base was not fully secure. There were still reports of the possible secondary element probing the south fence. 2 operators were still on the perimeter. The gate was still blown, but the trauma bay held. Every patient in it was alive. Baptiste came back at 4:38, the gauze still taped to his forehead, carrying water bottles for everyone in the room without being asked. He handed one to Brooke last. When she took it, he held it a second longer than necessary and said very quietly, "6 confirmed KIA on their side, 0 on ours." He paused. "That doesn't happen." "It happens when you hold the line," Brooke said. "We barely held it," Baptiste said. "If Carver had gone down in that first 60 seconds with nobody to catch him." He stopped. He looked at the floor. When he looked back up, his voice was different, stripped of the soldier's careful, emotional regulation. "Just a man. He's my closest friend on this base. We've been together since Fallujah." Brooke looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time since she had arrived at FOB Kestrel, something in her face opened slightly, like a door cracked on its hinge. "He's going to be fine," she said. "I mean that." Baptiste nodded. He pressed his lips together. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. And then, with something that was almost warmth, "But I'll accept it." At 4:55, Dylan found her alone at the back of the bay, standing with her hands braced on the supply shelf, head down, breathing slowly and deliberately. He had seen this before, not in her, but in combat veterans he had treated. The moment after. The moment when the body finally gets permission to process what the mind held off during the crisis. He stood near her without speaking. After a moment, she said, "I'm fine." "I know," he said. "I just—" He stopped, started again. "I've been watching you work for 6 days, and tonight I watched you save 4 men under fire. And I just want to say, I don't know who you are, but I am glad you're standing in this room." Brooke straightened. She picked up the water bottle Baptiste had brought her and took a long drink. The bracelet on her wrist caught the light from the flood lamp. 3 letters, silver, worn smooth from years of contact with skin and work and memory. Dylan looked at it. He had noticed it before but never asked. "JRR," he said softly. "Who was that?" The question landed in the silence between them. Brooke looked at the bracelet. Her thumb moved over the letters once, the way a person touches something holy or something that still hurts. "Someone who deserved to make it home," she said. Dylan didn't ask anything else. At 5:10 in the morning, Torres came to find Brooke with a look on his face that was different from every look he had worn that night. Not the urgency of combat, not the controlled fear of a soldier in a firefight. Something quieter and more unsettling. "The after-action is being called for 0800, he said. "Ferris wants everyone present. Full debrief." He paused. "Voss requested your personnel file." Brooke looked at him. "Not to cause trouble," Torres added quickly. "After tonight, I think he just needs to understand." "He's going to get more than he bargained for," Brooke said. Torres nodded slowly. He had understood that for hours. He just wasn't sure his senior chief had. "Can I ask you something straight?" he said. "You can try. Are you what I think you are?" Brooke picked up a clipboard and started writing her post-incident documentation with the same steady hands that had placed chest tubes and controlled femoral bleeds and stitched a head wound with a staple kit from her pocket. She wrote the time, the date, the patient names, the procedures, the outcomes. She wrote it the way a soldier writes a report, precise, factual, without ornamentation. "What do you think I am?" she said. Torres looked at her, at the way she stood, at the bracelet, at the medical kit that was packed like a combat load and not a hospital bag, at the hands that had never shaken through any of it. "I think you've been shot at before," he said. "A lot, and not by accident." Brooke finished her documentation. She set the clipboard down. "Get some rest, Torres," she said. 0800 comes fast. She walked to the back of the bay and pulled the curtain across the supply alcove that doubled as her sleep space. And Torres stood alone in the middle of the trauma bay, with 4 patients breathing steadily around him, and the absolute certainty that the woman behind that curtain was carrying a history that would change everything he thought he knew about this deployment. He was right. And in 4 hours, in a tent with 14 operators and a lieutenant commander and a senior chief who had spent 6 days trying to categorize a woman he fundamentally could not understand, every single one of them was going to find out exactly why. The 0800 debrief was supposed to start at 0800. It started at 7:53 because Voss walked in 7 minutes early, sat down at the head of the folding table, and stared at the door like a man who had made a decision in the night and was ready to live with the consequences of it. The tent filled quickly. Torres, Halstead, Baptiste with the taped gauze still on his forehead and 4 hours of sleep behind his eyes. 6 other operators whose names Brooke had not yet learned, but whose faces she had cataloged the way she cataloged everything on this base. Quietly, precisely, filed away without ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Ferris came in at 0756 and took the seat at the opposite end of the table from Voss without looking at him, which told Brooke that a conversation had already happened between them that neither man was finished with. Dylan sat next to Brooke. He had brought 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without comment, and she picked it up without thanks. And they sat shoulder to shoulder in the particular, comfortable silence of 2 people who have been through something together that changed them both and haven't had time yet to talk about it. Brooke had slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She had woken up the way she always woke up, completely, instantly, no gradient between sleep and full awareness. She had checked on all 4 patients before anyone else in the bay had stirred. Webb was stable, Carver was stable, and had regained consciousness at approximately 600, looked up at the ceiling, said, "Did we hold?" And when Baptiste, who had not left his side, said yes, Carver had closed his eyes and gone back to sleep with the particular peace of a man who got the only answer he needed. Reyes was awake and complaining about the IV line pinching, which Brooke took as an excellent sign. The 2 operators with lacerations and blast concussion had been cleared for light duty. Nobody had died. Ferris opened the debrief the way commanding officers open every difficult debrief, with facts, because facts are neutral ground, and neutral ground is where you establish authority before you walk into the contested territory. He covered the timeline of the attack, the breach at the east gate, the secondary probe at the south fence that had never fully materialized, the confirmed enemy KIA count, the status of the base infrastructure. He covered it all in 7 minutes with the efficiency of a man who understood that everyone in the room already knew the facts, and what they were really here for was everything underneath them. Then he said, "I want to acknowledge our medical personnel. HM2 Cross and contractor Aldridge managed 6 critical casualties under active fire with 0 fatalities. That is not a routine outcome. That is an exceptional one." Every head in the room turned toward Brooke. She looked at her coffee cup. "Cross," Ferris continued, "your performance last night reflects the standard this unit expects. I'm putting a commendation in your file." He paused. "Aldridge." Another pause, longer this time. "Your contract paperwork doesn't fully capture what happened in that bay last night. 2 chest tube insertions, femoral bleed control, mass casualty management under fire. Those are not standard nursing competencies." The room was very still. "They are if you've trained for them," Brooke said. Where did you train for them? Ferris asked. This was the moment. Brooke had known it was coming since Torres had told her about the file request at 0510. She had spent 90 minutes of her 2-hour and 40-minute sleep turning it over. Not wrestling with it exactly, more the way you turn a coin over in your fingers before you place it on the table. She had known since day one that this base would eventually ask the question. She had simply been waiting for the right set of circumstances to make the answer worth giving. 6 patients alive in the trauma bay seemed like the right circumstances. I trained for them in the United States Marine Corps, she said. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences that had come before. Those had been charged with uncertainty, with the particular tension of people trying to read a situation they didn't have enough information for. This silence was charged with the static of a room full of highly trained people simultaneously revising everything they thought they knew about the last 6 days. Halstead's mouth opened. He closed it. Torres looked at the table. He already knew, or had suspected enough that knowing wasn't a surprise. But hearing it said plainly, in the debrief tent at 0800, with all of them present, landed differently than suspicion. Voss said nothing. He looked at Brooke with an expression that was impossible to read and made no attempt to make it readable. Ferris leaned forward. Your prior service? Yes, sir. Your contract file lists nursing credentials. University of Arizona, Bethesda Medical, 3 years combat trauma experience in multiple theaters. It does not list prior service. It lists what was relevant to the contract, Brooke said. I was hired as a trauma nurse. My nursing credentials are legitimate and current. Nobody's questioning your credentials, Ferris said. Then what are we questioning? Brooke said. Her voice was even, not defensive, asking a genuine question. Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then he said, walk us through it. Brooke set down her coffee cup. She folded her hands on the table, and she started talking. She had joined the Marines at 18 out of a town in Arizona so small it had 1 stoplight and 2 churches and a VFW hall that was better attended than either of them. She had enlisted because her father had served, and his father before him, and because she had grown up understanding, not abstractly but in her bones, that service was not a career choice, it was a statement about what you believed a life was for. She had gone through basic with the particular ferocity of someone who had something to prove, not to the core, but to herself. And she had come out the other side understanding that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She said all of this without sentimentality. The way you describe geography, here is where I came from, here is the path, here is where I arrived. She talked about the Lioness program. She watched several faces in the room sharpen with recognition when she said the name, Baptiste especially, because Baptiste was a Marine, and he knew the program and what it actually meant versus what the official description said it meant. She explained it briefly. Female Marines embedded with infantry units, cultural liaison on paper, combat exposure in reality. 3 deployments, she said, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I carried a rifle on every one of them. I was in kinetic environments on every one of them. She paused. I lost people on every one of them. Her thumb moved to the bracelet on her right wrist. Just once, just a touch. Then her hands were still again. After my 3rd deployment, I went back to school, she said. I'd been doing field medicine since my 2nd tour. You learn fast when the alternative is watching someone bleed out. And I wanted to do it properly. So I got the degree. Then I got the certifications. Then I went back. Back where? Halstead said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud exactly, but the question had come out before he could stop it. Back to the forward edge, Brooke said simply, as a contractor. Because it's where I know how to be useful, and because there are things you can do in a trauma bay on a FOB that you cannot do in a hospital in Phoenix, and I am not particularly good at doing less when more is possible. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Baptiste said very deliberately, What was your unit? Brooke looked at him. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. 2nd Tour, 1st Marine Division, Embedded Advisory Element, 3rd Tour. Baptiste sat back in his chair slowly. His expression had changed into something that was recognition and something older than recognition. The look of someone who has just connected two pieces of information that had been sitting in different compartments of their memory for years. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, he said. Al-Qaim, 2006. Yes, Brooke said. Operation Steel Curtain Follow-On, Baptiste said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Baptiste looked at the table for a long moment. When he looked back up, there was something in his face that Brooke had not seen directed at her since she arrived on this base. It was not just respect, it was recognition. The specific, weighted recognition that passes between people who have been in the same fire, even years apart, even without knowing each other. There was a Lioness team attached to the 7, he said quietly. 2006. They held a checkpoint for 6 hours with an undermanned infantry unit after the main element got pinned. 2 Marines wounded, none KIA. The account made it into the operational record, but the names were classified. Brooke said nothing. Was that you? Baptiste said. The room was so quiet that the distant sound of the base generator, 300 yards away, was audible. Brooke looked at Baptiste. She looked at him with those green-gray eyes that had watched more than most people in this room would ever see, and she said, one of the 2 wounded Marines was a 22-year-old Lance Corporal from Decatur, Georgia. The other was a staff sergeant from Fort Worth, who told me 3 times that he was fine and passed out twice. She paused. I held that checkpoint because the alternative was giving it up, and I was not going to give it up. Baptiste pressed his lips together. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man placing something carefully in the right compartment. Voss had not spoken since Brooke began. He had sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his face unreadable, and he had listened. Not performed listening, actually listened. The way dangerous people listen when they have realized they have made a critical error in judgment and are now in the process of determining exactly how significant that error was. He spoke now. The personnel file, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement directed at Ferris. Ferris looked at him. What about it? It doesn't list any of this. No, Ferris said. It doesn't. Why? Ferris looked at Brooke. There was a slight pause that carried information inside it. The pause of a man who knows more than he's been authorized to say and is choosing his words accordingly. Brooke answered before Ferris could navigate the pause. Because I didn't put it there, she said. Voss looked at her. Why not? Because I came here to do a job, she said, not to manage how people perceive me while I did it. She held his gaze without blinking. My service record doesn't change how I insert a chest tube. My combat history doesn't change whether the defibrillator works. What I put in that cabinet is in that cabinet because I know what a mass casualty event looks like, not because of what's in my file. Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the night of your second deployment, the checkpoint. He had pulled up something on his tablet and was reading from it with the look of a man who had done the research before the debrief and was now confirming what he already suspected. Operation Steel Curtain Follow-On Operations, November 2006. An embedded female Marine element held a compromised checkpoint for 5 hours and 40 minutes against repeated contact while a rescue element was rerouted. The after-action noted, and I'm quoting directly here, the female Marine element demonstrated exceptional combat effectiveness and medical competence under sustained fire, preventing the loss of 2 wounded Marines and maintaining the integrity of a critical resupply route. He set the tablet down. That's you. That's the record, Brooke said. I'm asking if that's you. A beat of silence. Yes, she said. Halstead made a sound that was not quite a word. One of the other operators leaned back in his chair and looked at the tent ceiling with the expression of a man doing rapid recalculation. And then Torres, who had brought her coffee and sat across from her and told her she carried herself like someone who'd been shot at. Torres, who had pressed both hands on Reyes's wound and stayed when she told him to stay. Torres said something that cut through the formal weight of the debrief with the clean simplicity of someone who was done with the official version of events. "Senior Chief," he said, looking at Voss, "you told her to stay in her lane." The words sat in the air. Voss looked at Torres. Torres held the look without apology. "I'm aware of what I said," Voss said. "She reorganized the bay on day 2, Torres said. "You told her it wasn't her place. She fixed the defibrillator. You told Ferris she had an attitude problem. Last night she put 2 chest tubes in under incoming fire and held a femoral bleed with her bare hands while you were at the command post. And Webb and Carver and Reyes are alive because of it." Torres paused. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you, Senior Chief. I'm saying it because somebody in this room needs to say it out loud before we move on." The silence that followed was the most charged silence in a morning that had not been short of them. Voss looked at Torres. He looked at Brooke. He looked at his hands flat on the table. Then he said, "You're right." Torres blinked. He had expected resistance, justification, redirection. The 2 words landed so cleanly and so plainly that for a moment nobody quite knew what to do with them. "I misjudged the situation," Voss said. "I misjudged you." He was looking at Brooke now, and the granite in his expression had not softened exactly. It was more that it had reorganized itself into something more honest. "I put you in a category on day 1 because that's how I manage unknown variables on my base, and I was wrong." Brooke looked at him. The moment stretched, and then she said, "You were doing your job." "I was doing it badly," Voss said. "Yes," Brooke said, "but you held pressure on Reyes's wound for 10 minutes at 0400 in the morning, and you asked me what I needed instead of telling me what I couldn't do. That counts for something." Voss held her gaze for a moment that was almost uncomfortable in its honesty. Then he nodded. Once. And the room exhaled collectively. Ferris let the moment settle before he spoke again. "There's one more thing," he said. He looked at Brooke with a particular expression of a man who is about to shift the ground under everyone's feet. "Your full service record, the parts that weren't in the contract file." He paused. "I requested them last night after the attack. I got a response at 0630. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "You were awarded the Purple Heart in 2007. Al-Qayyum, secondary to the checkpoint engagement. Shrapnel wound to the left shoulder. Treated in the field. Returned to duty." Several things happened at once. Dylan, who had been quiet for the entire debrief, turned to look at Brooke with an expression that was equal parts shock and something like the feeling of a puzzle piece snapping into a shape you hadn't known was incomplete. Baptiste closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. Halstead said, under his breath, "Oh my God." Torres did not react, because Torres had known. Had known since the night before in the trauma bay, had known in the marrow-deep way that soldiers know things about other soldiers. And Voss said, very quietly, "You were wounded." "It was shrapnel," Brooke said. "It wasn't significant." "It was significant enough to earn a Purple Heart," Voss said. "A lot of things earn Purple Hearts," Brooke said. "It doesn't mean they're worth talking about." "You never said." "I came here to do a job," she said, and her voice was still even, still steady. But underneath the steadiness, there was something that had not been there at the beginning of the debrief. The faint, unmistakable sound of a person who has carried something alone for a very long time, and is only now, in this room, with these people, beginning to consider the possibility that carrying it alone is no longer the only option. "I didn't come here for recognition. I didn't come here to manage your feelings about my background. I came because there are people in forward positions who need medical support, and I know how to provide it. That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story," Baptiste said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made several people look at him. "The whole story is that you've been serving this country since you were 18 years old, in ways most people in this room didn't know were possible. And you walked onto this base with a medical kit and a single duffel bag and a bracelet with 3 letters on it, and you didn't say a word about any of it. He paused. That's not just doing a job, Brooke. That's something else entirely. It was the first time anyone on the base had used her first name. The sound of it in the tent was small and enormous at the same time. Brooke looked at Baptiste. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She pressed her thumb against the letters once, the way she had done the night before in the trauma bay, when Dylan had asked who JRR was. James Rooker, she said without being asked. Lance Corporal. He was 22. He was from Savannah. He wanted to be a high school football coach when he got out. She paused. He didn't make it out. I've been trying to make it count for both of us ever since. The tent was completely silent. Outside, the base was beginning its morning sounds. The generator, the vehicle checks, the distant radio chatter of a FOB resuming operations after a night that had tried to stop them. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 14 operators and the medic, and the commanding officer, and the senior chief sat with what Brooke had just put in the room and let it be what it was. Dylan pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He was 23 years old, and he had never heard anything that made him understand so completely, in a single sentence, why a person chooses the life they choose. Ferris broke the silence the way a good commanding officer breaks silence. Not to dispel it, but to honor it by moving forward deliberately. This debrief is complete, he said. Operational notes will be filed by 1200. All personnel are stood down for a 4-hour rest period, effective immediately, except for those assigned to current watch rotation. He looked at Brooke. Aldridge, a word. The room emptied. Baptiste was the last to go. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Brooke and said nothing. He didn't need to. The look said everything. The recognition, the respect, the particular bond that forms between people who have walked the same ground in different years and understand each other's choices without explanation. He nodded once and walked out. Ferris waited until the tent flap stopped moving. Then he looked at Brooke across the empty table. I owe you an apology, he said. You've been professional throughout, Brooke said. I signed your contract without reading your full background, he said. That was on me. If I had read it, the last 6 days would have been different. The last 6 days were fine, Brooke said. I didn't need anyone to read my background. Ferris looked at her steadily. There's something else, he said. The operation that your Lioness element supported in 2006. The resupply route you held. He paused. That route was the supply line for a SEAL element operating 20 miles north. The operation that resupply supported ran for 11 days and resulted in the capture of a high-value target responsible for the deaths of 43 American service members. He let that sit for a moment. The men on that operation came home because you held that checkpoint. Some of those men are still active. Some of them have been on this base. Brooke was very still. Voss was on that operation, Ferris said quietly. The silence that followed was not like the other silences. It was deeper. It had history in it, the specific weight of a world that is smaller than it appears, of connections that run underground for years before they surface in a debrief tent in East Africa at 8 in the morning. Brooke looked at the door through which Voss had walked 60 seconds ago. She understood now what had been in his expression at the table when the record was read aloud. Not just the recalibration of a man correcting a misjudgment, the expression of a man who had just learned that the woman he spent 6 days trying to categorize as a civilian contractor was part of the chain of events that brought him home from the most important operation of his career. He doesn't know, she said. He does now, Ferris said. I told him this morning at 06:30 when the full record came back. He paused. He asked me not to bring it up in the debrief. He said he wanted to handle it himself. Brooke thought about that, about Voss at the head of the table, hands flat on the surface, listening to her with that unreadable expression that she now understood was not unreadable at all. It was a man sitting with the full weight of something enormous and choosing not to perform his reaction, but to actually feel it, which is always the harder thing. How do you want to handle this going forward? Ferris said. Brooke looked at him. She looked at the empty chairs around the folding table. She looked at the door. The same way I've been handling everything, she said, one patient at a time. Ferris nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something more and decided against it, which Brooke respected. Some things don't need the last word. She stood and walked to the door and pushed the tent flap open and stepped out into the morning heat. The base was awake and moving around her. Soldiers at their tasks, the hum of a functioning FOB finding its rhythm after a violent night. She walked toward the trauma bay. She had 4 patients to check. Voss was standing outside the trauma bay door. He was not leaning against the wall or checking his radio or doing any of the things people do to pretend they are not waiting. He was simply standing, facing the door, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is making himself do it before he has the chance to change his mind. He heard her footsteps. He turned. They looked at each other in the morning light for a moment that neither of them tried to fill with words. Then Voss said, Al-Qayyum, November 2006. Yes, Brooke said. I was on the element you held that route for, he said. I didn't know. Until this morning, I had no idea. He stopped. The granite jaw, the squared shoulders, the physical authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. All of it was present. And underneath it, visible now in a way it had not been before, was something human and unguarded. I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take a second. Brooke waited. 11 men came home from that operation, Voss said. My team, my people. They have wives and children and careers and lives that continued because that route held. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. I spent 6 days on this base treating you like a problem I needed to manage. And the truth is that I owe you more than I can calculate. He paused. I'm sorry. For all of it. From day one. Brooke looked at him. She looked at this man who had slammed his palm on a table and told her to stay in her lane, and pinned her against a wall, and dismissed her in front of his team, and then held pressure on a femoral wound at 4 a.m. because she told him to, and hadn't hesitated for a single second. You held that wound for 10 minutes without letting go, she said, even when the shooting started again, even when every instinct you had was telling you to move. She paused. That's not nothing, boss. Voss looked at her. We're even, she said. She pushed open the trauma bay door and went in to check on her patients. Carver was awake when she walked in. Not groggy awake, not the half-conscious drift of someone who had lost blood and was still finding their way back. Fully awake, sitting up against the gurney rail at a careful angle that told Brooke he had been testing his range of motion before she got there, and had stopped the moment he heard the door. He had the look of a man who was embarrassed to have been caught being careful with himself. Don't, she said, without looking up from the chart she had already picked up. Don't what? Carver said. Don't pretend you weren't just seeing how far you could move without reopening the seal, she said. The answer is not as far as you want to. Carver looked at Baptiste, who was sitting in the folding chair beside the gurney, and had apparently been there since approximately the moment the debrief ended. Baptiste spread his hands in a gesture that said clearly he had nothing to do with this. How's the pain? Brooke asked. Manageable, Carver said. Scale. 4. Lie to me again and I'll make it a 6 myself, she said pleasantly, checking the seal over his chest wound with practiced hands. He hissed once. She made a small sound of satisfaction at what she found. The seal was holding. The wound was clean. The tissue beneath her fingers had the right resistance. Real number. 7, Carver said through his teeth. Better. Dylan. She called across the bay without raising her voice. Carver gets another cycle of analgesic. Adjust the dosage up by 15% and note it. Dylan, at Webb's gurney running a morning check, said, Copy, and reached for the medication log with one hand while keeping the other on Webb's IV line with the kind of multitasking that Brooke had quietly, systematically taught him over 6 days by simply doing it herself in front of him until his hands learned what his brain was still processing. Webb looked better. His color had come back. He was not yet speaking much, but his eyes tracked clearly and his vitals had stabilized through the night in a steady, reassuring climb. When Brooke leaned over to check his tube placement, he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and the particular bewilderment of someone who has been very close to an edge they didn't choose to approach. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "Baptiste told me what you did," Webb said. His voice was rough from the tube, but it was his voice. "The chest tube, under fire." "Baptiste talks too much," Brooke said. "He said you didn't even flinch when the RPG hit the north wall." "I was busy," she said. Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I have a daughter. She's 3. Her name is Cora." He stopped. I need someone to know that." Brooke's hands paused for exactly 1 second on the tube check. Then they continued. "I know it now," she said. "Cora is going to see her father come home. Put that in your head and keep it there." Webb pressed his lips together and nodded and looked at the ceiling of the trauma bay and did the thing that men in trauma bays sometimes do when they have been close enough to death to see it clearly and come back. He allowed himself the full weight of the relief, the terrifying, enormous private relief of someone who made it and did not apologize for it. Brooke moved to Reyes. Reyes was sitting up fully, eating a protein bar with the focused intensity of someone who had been told no solid food for 6 hours and had waited out every minute of it with the patience of a man who grew up with 4 brothers and learned early that things come to those who outlast everyone else. He looked up when Brooke approached and said, "Before you say anything, I know, don't stand on it, don't stress the wound. Light movement only." I have already recited this information back to Dylan twice. 3 times, Dylan said from across the bay. 3 times, Reyes said, without missing a beat. "I am an excellent patient." "You're a tolerable patient," Brooke said, crouching to check the dressing on his thigh. "Which is better than most." Reyes watched her work. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something and was choosing the right approach for it, which Brooke recognized because she had been watching people do that since she arrived on this base. She let him arrive at it in his own time. "Torres told me what happened in the debrief," Reyes said finally. Brooke didn't look up from the dressing. "Torres should be sleeping." "Torres was sleeping. He told me before the debrief." Reyes paused. "He said you were Marine Corps, combat deployments, the Lioness program." "That's accurate," Brooke said. "He also said you got a Purple Heart in 2007, and you never mentioned it to anyone." "Also accurate." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "My father served," he said. 22 years. He never talked about the hard stuff either. I used to think it was because it didn't matter to him." He paused. "I understand now it was because it mattered too much." Brooke finished the dressing check and stood. She looked at Reyes, this compact, dark-eyed operator who had been shot through the thigh 16 hours ago and was eating a protein bar and talking about his father with the kind of openness that some men only find in the aftermath of almost dying. "The dressing is clean," she said. "You're healing faster than you should be, which is annoying because it means you're going to start pushing boundaries in about 36 hours. "Is that a medical assessment or a character assessment?" Reyes said. "Both," she said. "Don't." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his whole face into something younger and easier. She was at the supply cabinet restocking her personal kit when the tent flap opened and Voss walked in. Not the way he had walked in on day 4 to check on Torres, with the proprietary surveillance of a man inspecting his territory. He walked in the way you walk into a room where you have been invited, which for Voss was different enough in the specifics of his posture and his pace that Brooke noticed it without looking up and noted it without comment. He stopped near the door. "How are they?" he said. "Stable. Stable, healing, cleared for light duty, Brooke said, working through her kit. Webb, Carver, Reyes, the other two in that order. Voss nodded. He stood for a moment. Can I? He stopped, started again. I wanted to talk to you. Not about the debrief, something else. Brooke finished with the kit and turned. She leaned back against the cabinet and looked at him. All right, she said. Voss pulled the folding chair from the corner, not Torres's chair by the gurneys, but the one near the door. The chair that had been there since Brooke's first day, and that she had never once used herself, and he sat in it. The action was so deliberate, so stripped of his usual physical authority, that Dylan across the room glanced up and then very pointedly went back to his charts. I have been trying to figure out how to say this since 06:30 this morning, Voss said. So I'm going to say it badly, and you can tell me if I'm getting the important parts right. Go ahead, Brooke said. I ran that operation in 2006, he said. Al-Qaim, the 11-day element. I was 29 years old. I had been a SEAL for 4 years, and that mission was the most important thing I had done in my career up to that point. He looked at his hands. We almost didn't make it out, not because of contact. We managed the contact. We almost didn't make it out because on day 7, our resupply was rerouted, and we thought we were going to run dry on ammunition and medical and have to abort the operation and lose the HVT. He paused. And then the resupply came through. Late, but it came. The route held. We never found out why it had been delayed or how it got cleared. Command told us the route experienced a complication and was secured by a supporting element, and that was the entire briefing we received. He looked up at her. That supporting element was you, he said. Brooke looked at him steadily. She said nothing. For 17 years, Voss said, I have known that someone held that route, and I have never known who. I went back through operational records twice over the years. The element was listed as classified. The names were classified. I couldn't get anything. He stopped. And then this morning, Ferris handed me a printed page, and your name was on it. He was quiet for a long moment. I spent the entire debrief sitting 3 feet from you, knowing what you did, and knowing what I had done to you in the 6 days before it, and trying to figure out how a person sits with that. You sat with it fine, Brooke said. I didn't feel fine, Voss said. Nobody feels fine, Brooke said. That's not the standard. The standard is what you do with it. You apologized. You meant it. That's more than most people manage. Voss looked at her. The granite was still there, but it was organized differently now. Not defensive, not territorial, just solid, the way good stone is solid when it's holding something up instead of keeping something out. Why didn't you say something? He said. When I was on day 1, day 2, every time I told you to stay in your lane, why didn't you just tell me to look up your file? Because I shouldn't have to, Brooke said simply. What I've done doesn't give me the right to walk onto your base and take up space without earning it here. In this base, with these people, in real time. She paused. I've been on FOBs where the person with the most impressive record was the most dangerous one in the room because they thought their past gave them a pass on the present. It doesn't. It never does. She looked at him. I had to earn it here. You just made it harder than it needed to be. Voss absorbed that. Fair, he said. Very, she said. And the word carried no heat, no residual anger, just the plain accuracy of a fact stated by someone who has stopped needing the other person to feel bad about it. The radio on Voss's belt crackled. He reached for it, listened, said, "Copy, 2 minutes," and stood from the chair. He looked at Brooke one more time. For what it's worth, he said, I'm going to make sure the right people know what happened in this bay last night. Not the debrief record, the actual story. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, Voss said. I want to. He held her gaze. There's a difference. He walked out. Brooke stood against the supply cabinet for a moment after the door closed. Then she picked up her kit, checked the inventory one more time, and got back to work. The next 3 days on FOB Kestrel operated in the particular heightened clarity that follows a violent event on a small base. Everyone slightly more awake, slightly more present, the way a near miss makes you aware of every breath. The gate had been repaired by evening of the first day. The south fence probe had been confirmed as a diversion element, and the intel team was running it down. 2 of the 4 critical patients had been moved to the secondary building for continued recovery. Webb and Carver remained in the trauma bay under Brooke's direct management, which nobody questioned and nobody would have dared to. Dylan had changed. It was subtle enough that only Brooke noticed it, and she noticed it because she had been watching him with the particular attention she gave to anyone she was responsible for. Not just his patients, but him, his competence, his confidence, the way he moved through a procedure. In the 6 days before the attack, he had been good, careful, thorough, capable. After the attack, he was something different. He had gone through a full mass casualty event as the second provider and come out the other side with all his patients alive. And that knowledge had reorganized something fundamental in him. He moved through the bay now with a quieter certainty, a steadiness that didn't come from the absence of doubt, but from having found out what happened when everything went wrong at once, and discovering that he could hold. She told him this on the morning of the second day after the attack. Not with ceremony, not with a speech. She just said, "You did good work 3 nights ago. You should know that." Dylan looked up from the chart he was working on. He seemed genuinely surprised, which told her he hadn't been telling himself this, hadn't been replaying it with any credit. He had been replaying it looking for what he'd missed, what he'd done wrong, the standard self-examination of a medic after a hard night. "I didn't do anything you didn't tell me to do," he said. "That's not accurate," Brooke said. "Reyes's IV line. I was at the chest tube. You saw the line was running too slow, and you adjusted without being told. That's the difference between a medic who follows instructions and a provider who thinks." She paused. "You're a provider who thinks. That's not a small thing." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. He pressed his mouth together and nodded and looked back at his chart and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right response. The twist that no one saw coming arrived on the morning of the 3rd day after the attack, at 09:20, in the form of a satellite call that Ferris took in his command post, and that lasted 11 minutes and left him standing in the doorway of the trauma bay 4 minutes later, with an expression that Brooke read instantly as the expression of someone delivering news they hadn't decided how to frame yet. She set down what she was doing. "What happened?" she said. Ferris looked at Webb and Carver, both of whom were awake and tracking. He looked back at Brooke. "Can we step outside?" They stepped outside. The heat hit them both. Ferris crossed his arms and looked at the eastern berm for a moment. "That was so calm," he said. "The after action from the attack went up the chain. Your name came with it." He paused. "The full name, the full record." He looked at her. "There are people up the chain who have been looking for you for a while." Brooke was very still. "Looking for me? How?" "Not the way you're thinking," Ferris said quickly. "Not trouble. The opposite." He uncrossed his arms. "There's a program being stood up. Joint Medical Advisory Element, Special Operations Support. Female combat veterans with both military and trauma medical backgrounds. They've been trying to build it for 3 years and they can't find enough people who fit both halves of the profile." He looked at her. After last night's after action hit the right desks, 3 people in the same hour sent the program director the same name. Brooke said nothing. "Yours," Ferris said. She looked at the eastern berm. She looked at the repaired gate. She looked at the base in the morning light, this collection of containers and wire and personnel and purpose that she had walked into 6 days ago as a contract nurse with a single duffel bag. "What does the program involve?" she said. "You'd be a program lead," Ferris said. "Not a contractor. Direct commission. They're offering a reinstatement pathway for prior service personnel." He paused. "You'd go back in, Brooke, as an officer." The name. Ferris never used her first name. He used it now the same way Baptiste had used it in the debrief, with the particular weight of a person signaling that they have stepped outside the formal structure of rank and role to speak to the actual human being. Brooke pressed her thumb against the bracelet on her wrist. The three letters, worn smooth. J.R.R. James Rooker, 22 years old from Savannah, who wanted to be a football coach. She stood with that for a moment. "When do they need an answer?" she said. 2 weeks, Ferris said, "but they're serious. And after what you did in that bay," he stopped, "you'd be building something, shaping how the next generation of people like you get trained and deployed. You'd be preventing the next FOB from running 6 days without knowing what it has, and keeping the next nurse from having to prove it under fire before anyone listens," Brooke said quietly. "Yes," Ferris said. She was quiet for a long moment. The generator hummed. Somewhere on the other side of the base, a vehicle started up. "I'll think about it," she said. Ferris nodded. He seemed to understand that this was not dismissal. This was a woman for whom decisions had weight and who did not make them lightly. He went back to the command post. Brooke stood outside the trauma bay door for another minute. Then she went back in to check on her patients. Carver was sitting up straighter than he had been. His color was better, his breathing easier, the tight, careful way he had been holding himself since he regained consciousness, gradually releasing as his body confirmed that the damage was being managed and the danger was past. He watched her do the morning check with the focused attention of a man who had been paying attention to everything since he woke up and was filing it all away. "You're going to be at full capacity in 3 weeks," Brooke told him. "The SEAL is doing what it needs to do. We'll do a final assessment before you're cleared for transport." "Baptiste told me about the debrief," Carver said. "About Al-Qaim, the checkpoint." Brooke continued her check. "Baptiste should consider a career in radio," she said. "He has a gift for transmission." Carver almost smiled. "He also told me about the Purple Heart." He paused. "My first tour, I had a trauma nurse. She was Navy, stationed on the ship we were attached to. She was good, very good. She saved a kid in my platoon who should not have survived by any reasonable medical assessment." He looked at Brooke. "But I never saw her pick up a weapon. I never saw her make tactical decisions under fire. I never saw her look at a room full of wounded and triage it in about 4 seconds while someone was shooting at the building." He stopped. "What I'm trying to say is, I've been on a lot of bases and I've worked with a lot of medical personnel, and you are something I have not encountered before." "I'm a nurse," Brooke said. "You keep saying that like it settles something," Carver said. "It doesn't settle anything. A nurse is what you have the degree for. What you are is something you built yourself over a long time out of choices most people wouldn't have the guts to make." He looked at her steadily. "I'm a hard man to impress. My wife will tell you that. She says I've been impressed by exactly 4 things in my adult life, and 3 of them were our children being born." He paused. "You're the 4th thing." Brooke looked at him. Carver was not a man who decorated his sentences. What he said was what he meant, precisely and without excess. She understood this because she was the same way, and recognizing the quality in someone else is always a slightly disorienting experience. "Get some rest," she said. "Your SEAL check's fine and your vitals are where I want them. You're going home." "So are you," Carver said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed, and moved on to Webb. Webb was making plans. Brooke could tell because his eyes had the particular forward-looking quality of someone who had stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about what came after. He was thinking about Cora. She could see it without being told. The 3-year-old, from wherever Webb called home, who was going to see her father walk through the door, which was the only outcome Brooke had accepted as possible from the moment Torres carried him through the trauma bay door with a thready pulse and shrapnel in his side. "How long before I can travel?" Webb asked. 48 hours if you continue at this rate," Brooke said. "Transport to the surgical facility, then evaluation for medical flight home." "Home," Webb said, like the word had a taste he hadn't expected. Home, Brooke confirmed. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he said, "What about you? When do you rotate out?" "My contract runs another 6 weeks," she said. "And then?" Brooke thought about Ferris at the command post, the satellite call, the program, direct commission. The next generation of people like her going in, trained and recognized, instead of having to hold a checkpoint for 6 hours before anyone wrote down their name. "Then I figure out the next thing," she said. Webb looked at her. "I hope the next thing is somewhere they know what they're getting," he said. She didn't answer, but she thought about it for the rest of the morning. Torres found her at noon, eating a cold MRE at the supply desk and writing her daily patient notes with the particular efficiency of someone who eats the way they do everything else, functionally, without fuss, while simultaneously accomplishing 2 other things. He sat down across from her and put both elbows on the desk and looked at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as his particular version of consideration. Torres didn't approach things sideways. He came at them straight and let the conversation find its own shape. "Voss told the team this morning," Torres said. Brooke looked up. "Told them what?" "Everything. Al-Qaim, the checkpoint, the operation it supported, what it meant for the 11 men on that element." Torres paused. He stood in front of his whole platoon and said it, out loud, all of it. He looked at her. "He also said that he spent the first 6 days of this rotation treating you like a problem instead of an asset, and that the failure in judgment was entirely his, and that it would not happen again." Brooke set down her pen. "He said your name," Torres continued. "Not contractor Aldridge, not the nurse. He said Brooke Aldridge, former United States Marine, combat veteran, and the reason 11 of us came home from the most important operation of this unit's history." Torres paused. Halstead cried. "He's never going to admit that, but he cried." Brooke pressed her lips together. She looked at the patient notes in front of her. She thought about a checkpoint in Al-Qaim in November 2006, about the cold and the dark and the weight of a rifle and the sound of a young Lance Corporal from Savannah telling her he was scared, and her telling him that scared was fine. Scared was honest. What mattered was what you did with it. "Brooke would have laughed at all of this," she said finally. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. But underneath the steadiness, present now in a way it hadn't been in the earlier parts of this week, was something that was not sadness exactly, but the particular resonance of a person who has carried someone with them for a long time and is, for perhaps the first time, allowing that carrying to be witnessed. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about him." She looked at Torres. The directness of the request, the simple and unadorned invitation of it, landed differently than the polite, careful questions she usually deflected. Torres was not asking to be polite. He was asking because he understood, the way soldiers understand, that the people we carry deserve to be spoken aloud. "He was 22, she said. "He was funny in the way that only genuinely brave people can be funny, not performing it, just naturally irreverent. Like he had decided early that the world was going to be serious enough without his help." She paused. "He called me Sarge, even though I wasn't his sergeant. He said it was because I acted like everyone's sergeant, whether they asked for it or not." The ghost of something crossed her face. He wasn't wrong. Torres smiled. "He talked about coaching football constantly," Brooke said. "High school football specifically. He had this whole theory about how the best coaches weren't the ones who knew the most plays, but the ones who understood what each kid needed to hear at the moment they needed to hear it. He said it was the same as combat leadership." She stopped. "He was right about that too." "He sounds like someone worth carrying," Torres said quietly. Brooke looked at the bracelet. 3 letters, silver, worn smooth. "Every single day," she said. Torres nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I think he'd be proud of what you did in this bay 3 nights ago. Brooke was quiet. She picked up her pen. She went back to her patient notes. "Thank you, Torres," she said. He stood. At the door, he stopped. "One more thing," he said. "The guys, the whole platoon, they've been talking about what to call you. Not Contractor Aldridge, something that fits." He paused. "Voss suggested it this morning. He said you needed a real name for this base." Brooke looked up. "Anvil," Torres said, "because nothing moves you and everything that hits you comes out changed on the other side." The trauma bay was quiet. Outside, the base generator hummed its steady note, the sound of a functioning thing that had been through a hard night and kept running anyway. Brooke looked at Torres standing in the doorway. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She looked at the patient notes in front of her. Webb, Carver, Reyes, all of them still breathing, all of them going home. "Tell Voss," she said slowly, "that I'll think about it." Torres smiled. "He said you'd say that." He walked out. Brooke sat alone in the trauma bay with the hum of the base around her and the names of her patients in front of her and the weight of 17 years of choices on her wrist, worn smooth and close to the skin. And she thought about a football coach from Savannah who never made it home, and a program that could make sure the next person like her didn't have to spend 6 days being invisible before anyone noticed what she was. She picked up her pen. She kept writing. Webb left on a Tuesday. Brooke knew it was Tuesday because Dylan had written the day on the whiteboard above the supply cabinet, a habit he had started after the attack, keeping track of time deliberately, the way people do when they've been reminded that time is not a given. Webb was transport ready at 700, cleared by Brooke at 650 after a final check that found everything where she needed it to be. His color was good. His breathing was even. The chest tube site was healing with the clean precision of a wound that had been managed correctly from the first moment, which it had. He sat on the edge of the gurney while Dylan disconnected his IV line and folded the medical transfer documents into his vest pocket. "I know I don't need to," Webb said. "I want to." He looked at her directly. "My daughter is going to grow up knowing her father. That is because of you. I don't know how to make that smaller than it is, so I'm just going to say it plainly and let it be what it is." Brooke held his gaze. She did not deflect. She had learned, over these last days, to let the things people needed to say actually land rather than redirecting them with efficiency. It was a small change. It was not an easy one. "Go home, Webb," she said. "Go home and coach her soccer team and complain about the neighborhood and take her to school on the first day and all of it. All the ordinary things. Don't skip a single one." Webb pressed his lips together. He nodded. He stood, tested his balance, found it solid, and walked to the door with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been horizontal for 4 days and is reminding his body what vertical costs. At the door, he turned back. "Cora," he said, "when you go back, wherever you end up, if it's good, if it's somewhere worth being, I want you to know that somewhere out there, a 3-year-old named Cora is alive because her father came home. Carry that with you." He walked out. Brooke stood in the bay for a moment after he left. Dylan was at the sink, his back to her, and she was grateful for it because she needed 30 seconds that nobody was watching. 30 seconds to let the fullness of what Webb had said move through her without managing it for anyone else's comfort. She pressed her thumb against the bracelet. She breathed. Then she turned around and started preparing Carver's discharge documentation. Carver left 4 hours later, at 1100, with Baptiste beside him carrying both their bags and the particular energy of 2 men who had been through something together and come out the other side closer than they went in. Carver's transport was a vehicle convoy to the regional airfield, then medical flight to the forward surgical hospital, then home. He shook Dylan's hand first. Then he turned to Brooke. He didn't reach for a handshake. He looked at her for a moment, and then he put his arms around her, carefully, accounting for his wound, and held on for a count of 3. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was the kind that means something specific, The kind that says, I know what you did, and I am not going to pretend it was ordinary. Brooke stood in it. She let it be what it was. 3 weeks to full capacity, he said, when he stepped back. You said 3 weeks. I said 3 weeks if you do the physical therapy correctly and don't try to skip steps, Brooke said, which means you are going to do the therapy every single session without arguing with the therapist. I never argue, Carver said. Baptiste behind him made a sound that was emphatically not agreement. Carver almost smiled. He looked at Brooke one last time with eyes that had the particular clarity of someone who has seen enough of life to know the difference between what matters and what merely seems to. You belong in this, Brooke, he said quietly. Whatever form it takes next, you belong in it. He walked out. Baptiste was the last one out the door. He stopped at the frame and looked back at her over his shoulder. He had the second gauze dressing now. Brooke had changed it that morning, the wound closing well, the staples doing their job. In 2 weeks, it would be a scar. In a year, it would be a thin line he would have to explain to people who hadn't been there. You're going to take the commission, he said. It was not a question. Brooke looked at him. You've been carrying this long enough alone, Baptiste said. Time to build something with it. He held her gaze for a moment. Brooke would tell you the same thing. You know that. He left before she could answer. She stood in the empty trauma bay, empty of patients for the first time since the attack, and she thought about James Rooker from Savannah, who wanted to coach high school football, and who called her Sarge, and who told her on the last night of his life that scared was okay as long as you did the thing anyway. She thought about what Baptiste had said. She thought about Carver's 3 weeks and Webb's daughter Cora, and the 11 men who came home from a northern operation in November 2006 because a route held, and nobody wrote the names of the people who held it. She thought about the next FOB, the next mass casualty night, the next trauma bay with a single medic running solo, and no one in the chain who understood what they had until the building was on fire. She went to find Ferris. He was at his desk when she knocked on the command post frame. He looked up, read her face in the way commanding officers learn to read faces. Quickly, accurately, without editorializing. He set down what he was holding. Tell them yes, Brooke said. Ferris looked at her for a long moment. You're sure? I've been sure since Webb told me about Cora, she said. I just needed to finish the work in front of me first. Ferris nodded slowly. He reached for the satellite phone on the corner of his desk. I'll make the call, he said. The program director is going to want to speak with you directly. There will be paperwork. There will be a process. There's always a process, Brooke said. It's a good one this time, Ferris said. I looked into it after the attack. They're building it right. Female combat veterans with medical backgrounds in leadership positions, not support roles. They're not trying to put you in a box. They're trying to use what you actually are. He paused. It's what should have existed 20 years ago. Yes, Brooke said. It is. She walked back to the trauma bay. Reyes was there. He had started coming back twice a day for wound checks, even after being cleared to the secondary building, which Brooke had pointed out to him was not medically necessary, and which Reyes had responded to by saying that he found the trauma bay calming, a statement that Dylan had received with visible delight. Reyes was sitting on the edge of the gurney, where Webb had been that morning, eating another protein bar, looking at the wall with the focused, blank expression of a man thinking about something he hasn't shaped into words yet. Cleared, Brooke said, checking the thigh dressing with practiced efficiency. You're at the point where you're going to start feeling better than you are, so I'm telling you now. Another 10 days of modified activity before you push it. Define push it, Reyes said. Anything that makes that leg bear asymmetric load under speed, she said. Running, climbing, lateral movement. If it's on the list, it's off your list. What about off the list, she said. Reyes sighed. He looked at the dressing, then at her. They're calling you Anvil, he said. It's official. Halstead made a thing. Halstead made a thing, Brooke repeated. He wrote it on the whiteboard in the ops tent. Reyes said. Anvil in big letters with a... He stopped, seemed to reconsider the artistic merit of whatever Halstead had added alongside the lettering. A drawing. It was enthusiastic. Brooke looked at the wall for a moment. Anvil. She turned the word over. Nothing moves it, and everything that hits it comes out changed on the other side. She thought about Voss sitting in the chair near the door that morning, choosing his words carefully. She thought about Torres pressing both hands on Reyes's wound and not letting go. She thought about Dylan catching the slow IV line without being told and adjusting it because he was thinking, not just following instructions. Tell Halstead I said thank you, she said. Reyes blinked. Just thank you? No conditions? No disclaimers? Just thank you, she said. He smiled with his whole face. I'll tell him. It's going to make his entire month. He stood, tested the leg carefully, found it solid. Hey, Torres told us about the commission offer, the program. He looked at her. You taking it? Already said yes, she said. Reyes looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who wants to say something large and is figuring out how to make it fit in a normal sentence. He pressed his lips together. He nodded twice. Good, he said. Just that, good. One word with the full weight of what he meant behind it. He walked out. His gait was even, barely a trace of the wound in it, which was better than she had projected 4 days ago, and exactly what she had been working toward from the first hour. The afternoon brought the thing she had not anticipated. At 14:30, Voss came to the trauma bay for the third time that week, and this time he did not come alone. He came with 7 of his operators, Torres, Halstead, 4 others whose names Brooke now knew, and one she was still working on, and they filled the doorway in a way that was simultaneously crowded and oddly formal, like men who had rehearsed something and were now committed to delivering it. Dylan at the supply cabinet looked at the doorway, looked at Brooke, and with the careful instinct of someone who understood the room, found a reason to step outside. Voss stood in front. He was holding something in his right hand, not a weapon, not a radio, not a tablet, something small. He looked at Brooke with the directness that she had come to understand as his particular version of sincerity. No softening, no performance, just the straight line between what he meant and what he said. We have a tradition in this platoon, he said. When someone earns their place, really earns it, not paperwork, not assignment, but the way that counts, we mark it. He paused. It takes a unanimous decision. Every man in this team. He looked at her steadily. It was unanimous. He held out his hand. In his palm was a piece of metal, stamped, flat, roughly the size of a dog tag. On it, pressed deep and clean, was a single word. Anvil. Below it, the date of the attack. Below that, the FOB designation. Below that, 11 small marks, not decorative, counted. 11. Brooke looked at it. She looked at the 11 marks and she understood what they were. Not the 11 casualties of the attack. The 11 men who came home from the northern operation in November 2006 because a route held. Voss had put them there. She knew without asking. She took the piece of metal from his hand. She held it. It was warm from his palm. It was heavier than it looked, the way things are heavier when they carry meaning. The tradition is that it gets worn, Torres said from behind Voss's shoulder. Not in a drawer, not in a bag. Brooke looked at the metal in her hand. Then she looked at the bracelet on her right wrist. 3 letters, silver, worn smooth. She looked at both of them for a moment, the old weight and the new one, the loss that had driven her and the recognition that had, finally, found her. She put the metal tag on her left wrist. She had to work the clasp with one hand, and Halstead, without a word, stepped forward and held it while she secured it. His hands were steady. He did not say anything. He stepped back. She stood with both wrists weighted now. Different weights, both real. Thank you, she said. The same words she had told Reyes to pass to Halstead. The same words carrying the same full measure of what she meant with no excess around them. Voss looked at her wrists. He looked at the old bracelet and the new one. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of all the authority and command register, just a man saying something true. "Those 11 marks are not enough," he said. "There should be more. There should be every man on every operation that route ever supported. Every man who ever drove through a checkpoint that held because someone stood in it." He paused. "But we start with what we know." Brooke looked at him. "It's enough," she said. The room was very quiet. 7 operators and a senior chief and a woman who had spent 17 years making herself useful in places that didn't always know what they had, standing together in a converted supply container in East Africa in the afternoon heat, with the generator humming outside and the base running its steady daily operations around them, like nothing extraordinary had happened here. Everything extraordinary had happened here. Halstead was the first one to leave. He shook Brooke's hand at the door with the awkward formality of a young man who has been moved by something and is not yet practiced enough at it to be comfortable. And she shook it back with the gravity it deserved. The others followed, Torres last, with a nod that carried everything they had already said to each other in the previous days, all of it compressed into a single look that required no additions. Voss was the very last. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the trauma bay, the reorganized cabinet, the working defibrillator, the supply rack accessible from both gurneys, the whiteboard where Dylan tracked his patients. All of it built better than it had been by hands that knew what they were doing and a mind that understood why each choice mattered. "My father was Army," Voss said. 30 years. He told me once that the best soldiers he ever served with weren't the ones who told you how good they were. They were the ones you only fully understood after the fact, after the crisis, after you had time to look back and see what they'd been doing the whole time. He looked at Brooke. He was right. "He sounds like he was a smart man," Brooke said. "He was," Voss said. "He also said the worst mistake a leader can make is to be so certain of what he knows that he stops being able to learn what he doesn't." His jaw was set, but his eyes were clear. "I made that mistake with you. I won't make it again. Not with you. Not with anyone." Brooke looked at him, at this man who had driven her against a wall on day 6 and held a femoral wound at 4 in the morning and stood in a debrief tent and said he was wrong, out loud in front of his entire team, and had pressed 11 marks into a piece of metal and carried it to her himself. "You already haven't," she said. "Everything after the bay counts." Voss nodded. He looked at the tag on her left wrist one more time, then he walked out. Dylan came back in 3 minutes later, found Brooke at the supply desk writing the final patient closure notes, and sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee. Still terrible, still hot, still everything that mattered about it. He set one in front of her. She picked it up. They sat in the particular easy silence of 2 people who have been through something together that made them permanently legible to each other, and they drank their terrible coffee and let the afternoon run its course. After a while, Dylan said, "Ferris told me about the commission." "I know he told you," Brooke said, writing without looking up. "You've been very carefully not mentioning it for 3 hours. Dylan smiled at the table. "I was waiting for you to bring it up. I'm bringing it up now." "Okay," he wrapped both hands around his cup. "How do you feel about it?" Brooke thought about that honestly, the way she did most things, without decoration, without the performance of how she was supposed to feel. She thought about the program, about building something from the ground up with the authority of her rank behind her, instead of having to earn the room's attention every single time by doing something extraordinary before anyone listened. She thought about the next Brooke Aldridge, whoever she was, some 18-year-old in a small town somewhere, who would join because she believed service was what a life was for, and what it would mean for her to step into a program that had been built by someone who had already lived it all the way through. "I feel like it's the right thing," Brooke said. I've spent 17 years doing the work of building something in places that didn't know what they had. This is a chance to build it into something they can't miss." She paused. "Rook believed you spent your whole life finding out what you were actually for. He thought most people never found it, and that the ones who did should go all in and not apologize for it." She looked at the bracelet. He was right. He was right about most things. Dylan looked at her. Then he looked at both wrists, the old silver with JRR worn into it, and the new metal tag with 11 marks pressed clean. He looked at them for a long moment. "He knew you'd end up here," Dylan said quietly, "doing this, whatever version of this." Brooke looked at the bracelets. "I think he knew I'd end up somewhere worth being," she said. "He didn't know the specifics." "Neither did you," Dylan said. "Neither did I," she agreed. The sun moved through the afternoon, and the bass shifted into its early evening rhythms. The noise of it familiar now in a way it had not been when Brooke stepped off the MRAP with her single duffel bag and her medical kit, and the bracelet on her wrist and nobody waiting to greet her. 6 days ago, 18 years of choices behind her, everything in front of her still to be determined. Dylan left at 1800 to do his evening rounds in the secondary building. He paused at the door. "Same time tomorrow," he said, meaning it the way he meant most things, simply, without complexity, as a statement of what he intended. "Same time tomorrow," Brooke said. He went. She sat alone in the trauma bay for a little while, in the quiet of the base evening, and she let herself be still in a way she rarely allowed. The way you are still when you are exactly where you are supposed to be, and your body knows it before your mind has finished the argument. She looked at the left wrist. 11 marks. Men who came home. Lives that continued because someone stood in a cold checkpoint in November 2006 and did not give it up. She looked at the right wrist. 3 letters. A man who did not come home. A life that ended before the football season started, and the high school kids got the coach they deserved. She looked at both of them together and she thought, as she had thought many times over the years, but never quite this clearly, this is what it costs, and this is what it earns, and neither one erases the other, and you carry both. She picked up her pen. She wrote the last line of the last patient closure note. She dated it. She signed it. She set it in the outgoing file for Ferris. She had 6 weeks left on her contract. In 6 weeks, she would pack her single duffel bag and fly out of East Africa and report to a program that would take everything she had built and everything she had lost and everything she had refused to stop being and put it to work building the next version of itself. She would walk into that program not as a contractor, not as a mystery, not as a woman who had to hold a line under fire before anyone bothered to read her file. She would walk in as an officer, as a leader, as someone the system had finally caught up to. She stood. She shouldered her medical kit. She reached up and turned off the portable floodlight that had been running since the night of the attack, the one Dylan had run across the base to retrieve while she worked in the near dark. And the trauma bay settled into the softer ambient light of the base evening. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. Outside, the base was alive with the ordinary sounds of people doing necessary work in a hard place. The vehicles, the radio chatter, the generator that had been running on a prayer and duct tape for more than 2 weeks now, and was still running because the people responsible for it refused to let it quit. Above the eastern berm, the sky was moving into its evening register, deep and wide, the kind of sky that makes you feel the exact size you are. Not small, just proportionate. One person in a large world doing what one person can do. Torres was sitting on an overturned crate outside the ops tent, not doing anything in particular, just sitting the way soldiers sit at the end of hard days. Present, quiet, occupying the moment without trying to turn it into something else. He looked up when she came out. He looked at both her wrists. He said nothing. He just nodded. The particular nod of a man who understands that the right response to some things is simply to witness them. Brooke nodded back. She walked across the base toward the command post to see if Ferris had reached the program director yet, her boots finding the familiar path in the dust, the two bracelets steady on her wrists, one worn smooth by 17 years of carrying, one new and clean and full of what was still to come. She had never been invisible on this base. She had simply been waiting for the base to open its eyes. And when it did, when the fire came and the walls shook and the night proved itself, she was exactly what she had always been, exactly what she had built herself into across 3 deployments and a nursing degree and a checkpoint in November 2006 and a trauma bay in East Africa at 3:47 in the morning. She was Brooke Aldridge, United States Marine, trauma nurse, ANVO, and she was just getting started.